They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand.
Well, welcome again to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. It is Tuesday morning, February 5th, 2019, and we have a terrific couple of guests coming on today. We're going to be talking about something that is very, very important to America and to Americans and to property owners in the West, for sure. And that is the issue of public lands and national forests and forestry in general, but we're going to be talking about how our natural resources are underutilized, and as a result, we're destroying our natural environment. And the people who have created much of this problem are the same people who are claiming that they are concerned for the environment. And underutilization and no management on national forests is a real problem in this country. Stewardship and using productively the resources that God gave us in this nation is very, very important for the future of our country and for the future of our environment. Poor countries have very poor natural environments because they don't have the money to do what's necessary to make the environment clean. And in America, we have one of the best programs in the world on environmentalism because we've generated enough income off of our natural resources to make that possible. So with that, I'm going to bring our guests online. First, I want to introduce Jim Carlson. Jim Carlson is a consultant out of the Midwest. He is someone who has worked very closely with local governments and with local people on environmental issues and on natural resource issues. And he is very good at finding the ways that the government is ignoring their own regulations and their own rules and putting programs and plans and rules in place that do not have statutory foundations. And he's working with groups all over the country, but he happens to be working with a group that out of southwestern Colorado in the Durango area on a project that, as a matter of fact, it was a program that heard first about and talked to Jim and talked to the people that were working there. And it became a project for Jim that he's been working on. And as a result, he is working now with the Trump administration on new rules for forests and forestry and national forest programs. And I also have on our call today a good person for the last 20 years and a gentleman who I think is probably one of the premier foresters in the entire country, and that is Dr. Peter Kolb. He is one of the founders of the Montana Forest Stewardship Program, and it is to train individuals on good forest management, good forestry practices, and working with individuals and government to create the best possible scenario for healthy forests throughout our state. So with that, Jim, welcome to the program, and please tell our listeners a little bit about some of the projects you've been working on.
Well, maybe what I'll do is I'll talk about our philosophy first, Dan, if I can.
Yeah, absolutely. You take this any direction you want to, Jim.
Sure. Our philosophy is very simple. We go back and dust off the statutory laws that Congress has made throughout time. We call the federal statutes law, and then we apply them to federal and state initiatives that are being promoted, typically by federal agencies with Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then when they when they propose an initiative, we study what their requirements are for that agency and determine if they've made the requirements and met the requirements. And then if they haven't, then we document those as part of the process. I'm also, Dan, the executive director of the Kansas Natural Resource Coalition, and that is a coalition of counties, local governments, that geographically occupies pretty much the western third of the state of Kansas. We also have urban environments as well. And there, local governments, we engage federal and state agencies. So that's who we are and what we do. Dan, some of the initiatives have been in Minnesota. We were on the program one time and talked about that. And what we're working on now is with the Trump administration and U.S. Forest Service, we've proposed a policy concept, a framework for repurposing forest management across the United States in accordance with 16 U.S.C. 475, which is the Organic Act of 1897. It's very, very simple. The Act's very, very simple. Back when, before things like the Affordable Care Act that was 1,200 pages or what have you, Dan. And what we want to do, or what we're proposing, is repurposing the management of forests from passive management, which is what we're seeing now in terms of the wildfires, the catastrophic wildfires that raged across the West last season, and probably we'll see that again. Those are a symptom of a greater problem, and that is inactive forest management. So we proposed a framework to the administration that would repurpose forest management, Dan, and so that's what I'd like to talk about today. But I know we have Dr. Kolb on the call, and certainly I'm very interested in what he has to say.
Well, thanks, Jim. Peter is a particularly good friend of mine because he's the person that introduced me to forest stewardship and to forestry. And I went through the stewardship program nearly 20 years ago in Billings, Montana, and I found that I had a love for forestry. And since then, I've been very active with the stewardship program in Montana. I'm still on the foundation. I actually termed out of the steering committee because I'd been on it so long that I guess they got tired of looking at me, I'm pretty sure. But anyway, it's something that Peter has the same love for, I guess I would say, the individual forester, the private property owner. The idea that forestry is best practiced when it's practiced by the people who have a vested interest in good, healthy forests. And that's how I got so involved with the program. Peter, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your background and some of the things that you've been working on, and then we'll get into this deeper discussion of what's right and what's wrong with our national forests.
Good morning, Dan.
Peter, and please tell our listeners a little bit more about you, because I think you're one of the most, probably one of the best foresters in the country, and I'm hoping that the audience can hear us now, but we are talking with Dr. Peter Kolb, and apparently I had some kind of a bad connection on my Skype line. But Joe, can you hear me now? Is everything coming through okay?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, good. I must have had some kind of a technical glitch with my Skype. I'm working with a new Skype provider down in southern Arizona, or a new internet provider, so maybe I'm having a few problems with that. Peter, I'm sorry that I had to go through this with you, but I want you to tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and some of the programs that you've been working with, because I do believe you're one of the premier foresters in the country, and I think your input into this discussion is invaluable.
Okay, well, glad to be on the program, Dan, and always enjoy interacting with you. I grew up in Wisconsin in a rural woodlot. Went to Michigan State and worked as a state forester in Wisconsin for about a year, and then moved out to Idaho and got my master's and my PhD at the University of Idaho. And in between, worked for the Forest Service and the state, and back then Champion and Boise Cascade, and then went on into more of a research capacity. So kind of went through the ringer of all the different land management agencies and entities, and figured out that my passion is understanding how forests function. My specialty area is the northern Rockies, Idaho and Montana. Of course, about 70% of that forested area is under federal management, and then there's still some private industry land. It used to be quite a chunk, a couple of million acres, but that's been reduced quite a bit. And for the last about 25 years, I've worked with private forest landowners across Montana, which is a wonderful group of people to work with, because it's the whole gamut of socioeconomic backgrounds, but pretty much everybody loves their forest and they want to do the right thing. They have a bottom line, so doing the right thing means how much money do I have to spend and how much money do I get out of it. So keeping a balanced budget keeps all of it real. And of course, in the last 20 years, wildfires and insects and diseases has also been quite a challenge to private landowners, as well as all of the forested lands. But again, private landowners are just an awesome group of people to work with. In my capacity as the state extension forestry specialist, I really enjoy working with them. I have to maintain a great deal of humility, because my philosophy is it's an exchange of information. Every time I work with a landowner, I usually walk away learning as much as hopefully they learn from me. And as an academician, I always tell people you got to be careful, because there's a lot of theories out there. And inappropriately couched, when a landowner comes to a workshop I present, they may go home the next day and start implementing some of the things that I taught them. So I have to do this all with a very strong conscience and a high standard of ethics.
Well, and Peter, I have to say, you're really the reason that I got so interested in the stewardship program, because you are an excellent teacher, and your focus has always been on private stewardship. Your focus has always been on utilization of our forests by private individuals, and that's I agree, that's part of what makes the stewardship program so important for Montana. Is those private inholders, those private forest owners are really key to keeping the wood products industry alive in Montana, because so much of our national forests have been shut down through, the lawsuits by several environmental attorneys and people who want to really keep people off the national forests. And that's the wrong idea, and that's why we're going to have this radio show today, so that we can talk about how important it is to utilize the forest products that are available, and how that can generate the necessary income to be better stewards on national forests as well as land. Jim, would you, I'd like to get you back into the conversation. You like to kind of talk about what's been going on with the program that you're doing now in Colorado. I hope you can openly talk about that, but how that was picked up by the Trump administration, and how you've been working with the Trump administration on refocusing the use of the forest and how you see that program moving forward.
Right. Perhaps maybe the thing for me to do, Dan, is talk about a parallel initiative in Colorado that we've been commissioned to work on, that has a policy background and bent, and then also a statutory bent and legislation that's currently in the Congress, and we'll use that as a framework to get into some of maybe the technical issues that Dr. Kolb could respond to as well. And
okay, go ahead.
Yeah, what you have in Colorado last week, Senator Bennett and Representative Negüez introduced what's called the CORE Act, and that act combines three previous bills that have been sponsored by Senator Bennett in southwest Colorado, and those would be wilderness withdrawals. And so those acts take in with them a proposal that's been out there for about 10 years or so, and that is the San Juan Wilderness Act proposal. So those bill numbers are S-241. That's the CORE Act, and then there's the S-2721. That's the San Juan Mountains Wilderness Protection Act. So here's the situation that we have is the Senators Bennett and Representative Negüez are proposing legislation that would vastly expand and add to the wilderness areas there. And it's just north of Durango for your listeners, Dan. The areas are just north of Durango. And the context is this. I want to talk about, I'll touch on the context as well. The context of this wilderness bill is, if your listeners are familiar whatsoever, a wilderness is basically a don't touch it type of forest management. So what Senator Bennett's proposing to do is add many acres to areas that are already inactively managed and have accrued a vast amount of forest litter. And to those that are watch the wildfires unfold across the western United States in calendar 2018, there was the 416 fire in La Plata County. And so the reason I bring that into the discussion is that these congressmen are introducing and proposing additional wilderness additions to the Colorado wilderness, when last year that we had the 416 fire, that actually there were evacuations for at least 8 weeks around Durango. Now, the important part about that is, Dan, is that the evacuations are some of the that would be around the Purgatory Ski Area, and there's many, I guess what we would call affluent properties around there, and those properties are less than 6 miles from the proposed wilderness addition. So you're having these conflicts there. That would be the Sheep Mountain Special Management Area that's proposed by Senator Bennett. Now, here's what we've done, and this goes back to what I shared with your listeners a moment ago, Dan, is that we went back and we started digging into the statutory basis behind these acts and behind the proposal, and it turns out that there's some real problems, because for those that are familiar with this area, they would withdraw the forest. They would withdraw through the National Forest, and that's U.S. Forest Service manages the surface estate, but there's also a vast areas of mineral estates down below that. And so these proposals would incorporate minerals, vast areas of minerals that are already permitted mineral. People have permits there, And then there's also in-holdings within the forest as well. And so we're looking into that as well because as you know, Dan, what will happen is there's private lands and then there's private mineral holdings that would be incorporated in these additions, and specifically the Liberty Bell Wilderness Addition, that it would be north and west of Telluride, for example. There's gold and silver holdings there. These are largely inactive mineral claims. But you also have the Liberty Bell East Management Area, and there's mineral holdings there. So the problem we have is these acts conflict now with the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act of 1960, and then there's a 16 USC 475, which those two acts are the organic acts that formulates the basis of U.S. Forest Service. And so what you have, Dan, is now those two acts actually preclude, and I'm going to say this on the air, they actually preclude the withdrawal of mineral estates. And so now you're having these acts proposed by Senator Bennett are inconsistent with organic law that forms the basis of the mission of U.S. Forest Service. So that's the statutory problem you have. You also have now a problem that with the inactive management, and then I'll turn it over back to you, Dan, after this comment, is we have the problem of the decades of inactive forest management that have accrued forest litter, and that now are resulting in the wildfires in that region, the 416 fire, but of course across the nation. And so we have a very real health and safety issue when our firefighters, for example, go in and to fight these fires, and there's a vast accrual of understory litter. So you have a health and safety aspect there. You have an environmental aspect in that once these catastrophic wildfires burn through, then you have vitrification of the soils, and this is the extent of my knowledge on this, but you vitrify the soils, so afterward, in the rainy season, you have erosion and then sedimentation of streams that can choke fish and present an environmental hazard. So what we're proposing is, and to work with the Trump administration in December 21st, came out with an executive order to promote active management of Americans' forests and improve conditions. And basically that is a common sense executive order to return back to active management. Now, what is active management? It's cutting of roads, it's thinning of forests, it's removing and clearing of understory so that to reduce the risks to wildfire. And so that's the common sense part, Dan, that you referred to, but it also has health and safety, economic and environmental components.
Right. And that's been a focus for a long time of the programs that you're working with, is understanding that utilization is a necessary component for good stewardship. And I think, Peter, this is a great place to segue you into the conversation, because that's exactly your specialty, and that's exactly why you have been working so hard to put together the stewardship program in Montana.
Well, I'm lucky because I work with private forest landowners, and in Montana, that's about 4.5 million acres of the 25 million acres of forested land here, and I'm very fortunate because in Montana, there's really only two laws that private forest landowners have to adhere to, and that is the Streamside Management Zone or Stream Management Zone Protection Area and the Slash Hazard Reduction Law. So basically, You need to impose special management around class 1, 2, and 3 streams to protect water quality and quantity, mainly water quality. And if you do any kind of management activity, you have to clean up the woody debris so that on a standard bad day, which is 2 weeks since any rain and about 85 degrees Fahrenheit and a 15-mile-an-hour wind, that if you get a fire, it won't produce flames that are taller than 4.5 feet, which is where the point where firefighters can't actively jump on it and suppress it, and they have to follow more of a containment strategy. So private forest landowners are really unfettered in their ability to manage their forest lands, which gives them a full toolbox to do different things, whether it's for insects, diseases, fire hazard, market conditions, all of those things. Now, in juxtaposition, federal lands are regulated by so many different laws. I mean, you not only have National Environmental Policy Act, National Forest Management Act, Environmental Appeals and Litigation, U.S. Code, Forest and Range Renewable Resources Planning, the Bankhead-Jones Farm Tenant Act, Endangered Species Act, National Historic Preservation Act, Clean Water Act, and Wilderness Acts. I mean, as Forest Service colleagues of mine tell me, they spend most of their time trying to figure out how to do something without violating one of the 200-some laws they have to follow. And to quote the former Forest Service Chief Jack Ward Thomas, he called management of federal lands the crazy quilt of conflicting environmental regulations. So federal land managers are in an extremely difficult position because through the last half century or longer, Congress, which manages national forest lands, has imposed all sorts of different rules and regulations and laws that the Forest Service has to follow, each of which had great intentions, but they were done in such a way that they didn't take into account previous laws, and so it is, before you do anything on Forest Service land, you got to sit down for a week or two with an attorney to see what you can legally do, and you know, the problem is a lot of these laws conflict with each other. And depending which administration happens to be in charge, they may decide to emphasize different parts of those laws. I mean, the Obama administration really emphasized clean water, and I mean, even private landowners nationally were at a real risk of losing their ability to manage their forests because the EPA was looking to regulate all water, even on private lands, and require planning and review of any management that would affect water. Well, any management affects water. So luckily that was repealed and didn't go anywhere. So now you have the Trump administration that is really emphasizing fuel hazard reduction and actually using commercial timber harvesting as a means to achieving those objectives. And, you know, this is also an important thing to consider because, you know, we can talk about fuels mitigation and wildfire mitigation, but if you're going to pay for it out of pocket to do that kind of work, you're looking at up to $2,000 an acre to do that. And, of course, we have millions and millions of federal lands, acres of federal land, so, you know, that would be an enormous drain that would match our national defense budget. So the other option, of course, is to do it through some kind of commercial endeavor where you have industries that can use wood fiber, whether it's fuel pellets or paper or construction lumber, all those things. And these entities would actually pay the Forest Service to do this work, generate tax dollars that would then go into our tax coffers rather than costing money to do. So anything having to do with federal lands becomes for lack of a better term, a pit of despair because it becomes a question of not only dueling laws, but then each side brings in its own experts, the academians, and so you might bring in a water quality specialist who will testify that harvesting timber is the ultimate evil, and it will result in increased erosion and lack of water. And you can bring in another expert and a hydrologist that studies snowpack and shows that thinning forests increases in the snowpack and increases the water yield into a drainage. And so what would seem like a straightforward approach when it comes to federal lands turns into this nightmare of conflict resolution.
Right. Well, I think that's pretty clear, but also, Peter, I think that we've gone so far away from what we used to do on the forest when I think that they were fairly well managed. One of the areas that concerns me the most is that the radical environmental lobby, the people who want to lock it up, have had such a important and such a powerful seat at the table that a lot of good common sense things have been pushed to the side, and good forestry practices have been pushed to the side. And as a result, much of our forest industry, our actual wood products industries, and our sawmills and things like that are no longer there, so we don't even have the infrastructure in place to properly utilize all the wood that's available. And so we've got to even rebuild our logging and our wood products industries in this country.
Well, that's very true. And, I just recently got the question, what would it take to start up another sawmill here in Montana? I mean, we still have a bare bones wood products infrastructure. I mean, our number of sawmills and wood processing facilities is maybe a third of what it was 20 years ago. And that's because 70% of our wood product, our wood resource trees are on federal lands. And the amount of wood coming off those lands is now 1/5 or 10% of what it was 30 years ago. And perhaps at some point, timber management might have been overemphasized on these federal lands, but the backlash has been equally devastating. And so there's really boils down to two trains of thought. And one is that's sold a lot by the conflict industry, is that forests, particularly in the western United States, national forests, will function in some form of perfect equilibrium without human interference, and that any kind of human interference just is detrimental to these ecosystems. The other train of thought is that these forested lands require some level of stewardship to optimize what they produce for humanity, whether that's water or wood or wildlife habitat or all of those types of things. Now, I tend to adhere more towards the second notion, because nature is not anything that plans ahead. Nature is just a series of reactive processes that starts with solar output from the sun that fuels our climate, and our climate fluctuates a lot. And, we get into the whole climate change discussion a bit, but the last 20, 25 years, we have been in a significant warming trend. And we don't need to get into what the cause is. There are many natural events that cause warming climate, and there's also human interference, and that's a whole discussion unto itself. But we are in a warming trend, which means drought, which means our forests are drought stressed, and trees are dying from drought, which exacerbates insect outbreaks like the mountain pine beetle that killed off about 6 million acres worth of trees in Montana. Now, many of those will come back again, but it's created enormous fuel conditions, and the drought itself has created terrible fuel conditions, and that's why we're having the fires that we're having. And there's lots of evidence that thinning and fuel reduction changes fire behavior. And again, the conflict industry loves to muddy the waters, and they'll say, oh, well, forest management makes no impact on fires. Well, that's true. It won't change whether a fire occurs, but it will dramatically change how that fire occurs, how severe it is, how much energy is put out, and whether or not control measures can stop a fire where you want it to stop. if it's in a high fuel condition, you just have to back off till you're in some area where there isn't fuel, where you can contain it. Whereas we've seen over and over again in thin forests with fuel reduction, that fire hits that, it changes behavior from a crown fire to a surface fire, and that's when our fire teams can actually contain and control it. So, we're dealing with entities that are trying to sell something, memberships or philosophies or whatever. And the thing is that our forests and nature operates on a boom and bust type of cycle. When the climate changes, forests die at a phenomenal level and they burn up. When it gets cool and wet, forests grow at a phenomenal level. And most people may not realize that from 1940 to 1980, in the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Rockies, we were in one of the longest cool, wet stretches of climatic fluctuation of the last 500 years. And so our forests grew enormously dense, and regeneration was very thick. And since the drought started and the warming period started in the late 1980s, these forests that grew so dense and expanded tremendously have been dying back at a phenomenal rate, and fire is just a natural consequence of that.
Right, exactly. Well, and Peter, that's exactly why what Jim is talking about is utilizing different factors and going back to a common sense approach to forest management that includes utilization and gets away from this lock it up mentality. Jim, I want to get you back into the conversation, but your whole focus has always been on looking at the laws and the statutes behind all these forest service plans and all these things that are being implemented. And about 9 times out of 10, and you tell me if I'm wrong on this, but about 9 times out of 10, these agencies start doing things that are actually counterproductive to the statutory basis, to the rules that they're supposed to be following, because of a, let's call it a tendency to politicize management rather than following the regulations. Am I right on that?
Well, I'm gonna return back and first of all compliment Peter for his balanced viewpoint. In managing private lands and forests, and I appreciated his comments about ethics as well. And then also when he rattled off 3 or 4 managed acts of Congress with which the U.S. Forest Service has to abide by. Those are also acts on top of other acts as well. So there is a virtual dogpile of acts of Congress that are often conflicting. So Peter is spot on with respect to that. What we do, Dan, as you're aware, is we go through and sort through as policy experts. We go through and we sort through administrative law, and this is statutes. Now, we can talk about case law in a minute, but we sort through the statutes, and then we get down to the organic statutes that are really the meat, or really are the bones that hold the meat. And then we focus on that and that alone, and don't get caught up in all the hoopla and technical discussion. And Peter was talking about the experts that come forward and say, well, the hydrologist says, yes, you can improve the flow to the streams, and that certainly is true. We agree with that. And so there's all this dust in there, and Dan, that we have to clear out. And here I'm gonna get a plug in for U.S. Forest Service in that management of forests nationwide is from a policy perspective is something that needs long-term policy. Okay, short-term policies. Typically, your average resource management plan is 15 years, maybe 20, and those are required under the National Forest Management Act of 1976. And so what we have here is that with changing administrations, and Peter talked about that, is that changing administrations now have these differing philosophies, and so U.S. Forest Service is virtually hamstrung in the sense that they have appropriations, changes in appropriations and priorities. And so what we have to do is sort through all the understory. Let's just use that. All the understory that has been accruing and get back to basics. And basics are USC, 16 USC 475, the purposes for which national forests may be established and administered. And I'll read you a segment of this, Dan, because it's crucial to what we're talking about. No national forest shall be established except to improve and protect the forest within the boundaries and for the purposes of securing favorable conditions for water flows and to furnish a continuous supply of timber for use and necessities for the citizens of the United States. That is 16 U.S. 475. That's the purposes for which national forests are to be established. That's the law. And so what we needed, and then there's a follow-up law to that is the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act of 1960. That's Public Law 86517. And this law here added to it, didn't derogate the original act, but it added to it. And again, it focused on two things: merchantable timber and water flow. Now, we're telling the administration, listen, if you go back to managing your forests let me back up. Our forefathers understood forest management. They understood it. This is by and large, this is fairly simple stuff. And so, and I'm not diminishing all the technical data. I'm not diminishing that. But by and large, forest management is very off the shelf, and it's policies, and you can manage forests very, very well if you do certain things. And they're organic garden rules for doing that. And our forefathers knew that when they codified 16 USC 475. And so if we return back to that, we can increase flows and to the watersheds of the United States. We can reduce the severity of wildfires, and we can repurpose and get through all of the limerence. And so that's what we said. We said the Trump administration, U.S. Forest Service, if we go back to basics, then we can also get around for example, all the case law that is hamstringing Forest Service and causing all these difficulties. Because now we have the attorneys, the crisis management or the crisis people who are profiting off of this. If we go through and repurpose. I think that's my bell, isn't it? Peter, are you still on?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Well, I'll keep talking on the assumption that we're still on the air. And I'll finish.
Oh, you are. Sorry, Jim. I had another disconnect on my Skype. You're on the air, and go ahead and continue with the discussion. I'd like to get Peter in on this discussion as well, because he can provide maybe a little bit of insight into some of the political things that are causing the Forest Service to not be able to respond in a rational way on some of these policies.
Well, it always boils down to money. Everything seems to do that. And of course, you've all heard that wildfires and the cost of fighting fires, which came out of the general fund budget of the Forest Service, has been bankrupting the Forest Service. They've been spending all their money on fighting fires, which didn't leave a whole lot of money left to do management actions. Now, that was just changed, so now hopefully fire will be treated like a natural disaster with its own kind of budget, and the money appropriated to the Forest Service to actually do some work on the ground will be available for that designated work. One of the other things that really needs to change on the Forest Service is you're never going to be able to repeal any of the acts and the laws that the Forest Service has to go through, because that has to go through Congress, and we know how difficult that can be. So what really needs to happen is, if you're going to go through this tremendous analysis or analysis paralysis, another term that former late Jack Ward Thomas stated, if you're going to go through it, and make sure it's worthwhile. So have enough of a land base in that discussion where you're going to implement management, and make sure that the management actions are not just for the next year or the next 5 years, but for the next 20 to 30 years. Because now we go back to how you're going to get the work done. Either you pull the money out of the tax rolls to pay for this enormously expensive work, or you support a local industry that can use the resource that exists in a national forest to generate tax income, so the wood products industry. And, we started out this discussion, what does it take to start up a new mill? You're looking at not only an investment of $50+ million to build the kind of sawmill that is competitive on today's market, where it's automated saws and all of that type of thing. It takes a while to develop a market for your wood product. So Home Depot or Lowe's wants a long-term commitment that you can provide them with the materials that they need. But likewise, that mill has to develop a purchasing base of where they're going to get their logs. Loggers nowadays are highly skilled professionals. I mean, you're looking at a training time of 3 to 5 years in using the modern equipment. The average logger is in debt for about $2 million. A harvester in itself is $1 million piece of machinery, the log truck, and all the personnel involved. So you're looking at an enormous capital investment for any kind of profitable wood products industry and its support infrastructure to develop for an area, and they're going to have to pay off those debts over a 20 to 30-year period. Well, nobody's going to invest in that kind of infrastructure if the Forest Service is guaranteeing wood for the next 5 years and nothing after that. So there needs to be consistency in what the Forest Service is doing on their land, and there needs to be some kind of a promissory note that, yes, over these next 20 years, we will supply X million board feet per year so that an investor can appropriately invest and develop a business model.
And that's assurance. Those are federal assurances that industry can point to by way of letters, and you said promissory note, memorandums of understanding. We have to have a long-term policy view when it comes to managing lumber from the forest and what's coming off, the material, the biological material that's coming out of the forest. And that's been part of that is the conservation groups have been so antagonistic that your lumber companies and your pellet people and everyone else has been very hesitant to make capital investments. You're spot on. And so what we need to do is we need to safeguard those industries. And we need to safeguard those industries for the long term, and we need a long-term policy on forest management. And they need assurance that their investments will go the long range. And so somewhere along the line, and Peter, he has to be fairly politically correct, I don't. Somewhere along the line, we have to start taking positions and saying no to, for example, the conservation groups. And the way to do that, or perhaps there was a history of clear cutting and those kinds of things, and there have been abuses that are legitimate. And somewhere along the line, we need forest management policies that are long-term, and then where we say we're going to safeguard these industries, we're going to safeguard these areas. Maybe we'll set aside withdraw these areas and say those are for, environmental stuff and your species protections and all of those things. Those are values that need to be looked after. And then we need to follow the law, and that's what it comes back down to. Is we have to follow the law. We have to protect in-holdings, and if someone's got legitimate mineral claims, we can't be obscuring those with things like the Corps Act and the San Juan Wilderness Protection Act. That the Congress right now, these proposals are being rolled out. There aren't even any maps for the Corps maps. And so Congress is considering legislation that where the in-holdings and the mining claims and all of those private things, Dan, have not even been identified. And we have an act that does that. That's the Federal Land Policy Management Act. And so the Corps Act should be subjected to the Federal Land Policy Management Act, and they should go through what Congress has already did in 1976 and go through and look at all of those things and protect all of those interests, all of those values.
Yes, and I think what we need to do in this country, and this is certainly something I think Peter would agree with as well as you, Jim, we need to re-educate many of the people in this country who have been sold on locking it up and closing it off, and that humans are an absolute negative as far as the environment is concerned. We need to get people. The problem is the East Coast and the West Coast and all the big metropolitan areas who are funneling money into these different conservation and environmental groups a lot of times don't have the slightest understanding of the natural environment. They just listen to the feel-good philosophies of some environmental group, and they need to be educated. We need to get people to understand that stewardship is a very, very necessary part of any kind of forest management.
Dan, can I comment on that?
Sure, you can comment on anything.
Well, and you and I have had this conversation before on other programs, and while I would add, education is important, and understanding is key to making good decisions and certainly good public policy. One of the things, I don't think we have an education problem here. We have a struggle, a power struggle for the public lands of the United States. And so I would say that while education is important, we need to return back to the laws that form the foundation, and we need to stay with those, and we need to establish a hierarchy of values, which means that at times there may be winners and there may be losers, and someone needs to understand that says, well, sometimes I don't get what I want. That it's the everybody gets a trophy generation, and we need to at times say no. So I'll turn this back to you with that comment.
Well, I agree, Jim. I mean, what it boils down to is that special interests have been the tail wagging the dog for a long, long time, and it's gotten much worse because we have drifted so far away from the basic fundamental things that this country is founded on, and that is individual private property, good policies that allow people to make a living. And we've gone into this kind of a collectivist thinking, and I'm going to stray a little too far here if I get too far off base, but that is part of the problem, is that we have changed our mindset in this country from protecting the rights of individuals to this collectivist thinking, and in the process we've destroyed a lot of the fundamental rights in this country that were necessary to produce products and to make a better and cleaner environment. And got to get back to the things that are more centrist in allowing us to use the profit motive and understand that stewardship requires utilization, it requires management, it requires a profit motive. And that's something that I want to really give Peter a great opportunity to talk about. We're going to be coming into a commercial break here real shortly, but Peter, we'll let you get started on that, and hopefully we can pick it up on the other side of the break as well.
This is The Micro Effect. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. And today my guests on the radio program are Mr. Jim Carlson and Dr. Peter Kolb. And Peter, I was getting your input on this whole process just before the break, and we went immediately into break, and I didn't get a chance to hear any of your response on that. But please tell us your opinion of what Jim and I were just talking about.
Soapbox here, and we're kind of getting at how do we change the problems regarding forest management that have plagued us for the last couple of decades. And we can get down to the nuts and bolts of particular projects, and we can go up to the 30,000-foot level of what are the larger philosophical issues. And I'm also a student of history. I mean, that's my other passion aside from forests. And I recently kind of explained it to an audience in the following way. Humanity is known for its ages of discovery and development. So we had the Stone Age and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and then the Industrial Age, Industrial Revolution. And arguably the last half century might be defined as the computer age, or the electronics age, where we've developed all these electronics that can do all of these computations for us and all of these types of things. Well, I was musing the other day of what age are we in now, and what would define the bulk of the population and how they think right now. And I kind of came up and coined it the fantasy age. That's where we are right now. Because when I look at what my kids watch, and I mean, one's in college and one's a senior in high school now, and all of the public policy debates and the news agendas and all that kind of stuff, is it seems like we're arguing a lot about hypothetical situations that have been created in someone's mind and don't necessarily reflect the reality of the situation. And so it is with our forest ecosystems, where, as I mentioned earlier, we seem to have this prevailing philosophy that if you leave nature alone, it will exist in some kind of utopian equilibrium state where everything lives happily. And, you know, that's not the reality of forests or nature. That's not how it works. Things are constantly changing out there. There is no such thing as a forest equilibrium other than for short periods of time, which might be 40 or 50 years or even 100 years. But again, when we look at our past climate variability, which is very important to look at when we want to look at issues like forest health now, we first need to realize or examine, are our forests right now functioning differently than they have been in the past? And so there's been a great deal of research in that arena. And one of my favorite works was published in 2010. It's called The Climate and Terrestrial Ecosystem Change in the U.S. Rocky Mountains and Upper Columbia Basin. It's a Natural Resources Report, NPS GRYN NRR 2010/260, for anybody that wants to look it up. And some really prestigious authors did a phenomenal amount of work in publishing this. And I just really quickly want to quote one of the main summary points on here. And it states that many Western ecosystems represent assemblages of plants and species that formed as a result of specific sequence of climatic conditions during the last several thousand years. In particular, many middle or late successional communities, those are what we would consider the equilibrium climax forests, were established during the colder, wetter Little Ice Age and would be unlikely to form under current climate and land use conditions. Likewise, restoration to historical baselines is at best challenging and in most cases impossible. Okay, so, you know, this is just, I put this as evidence, don't listen to me and my opinions and my experience. There's a lot of ecological work that has looked at that, and basically they all summarize the same things, is that forests and terrestrial ecosystems are dynamic assemblages of species, and they respond to changes in climate, and this is where we're at right now. And so you can either put a boundary around it, step back and watch it, which is not necessarily a bad thing. That's what happens in our wilderness areas. Or you can examine what's going on. You can see how can we help this system survive the current challenges, and importantly for our existence, how can we utilize some of the resources that come out of that and maintain the quality and consistency of supply of resources, whether it's water or wildlife or recreation or wood fiber coming out of that. And part of the problem is, again, we live in an age of fantasy where you ask average school kids of how these forests function, and they're going to go to their experience, which is some fantasy movie that was created, whether it's Avatar or whatever, where these forests are in some perfect form of equilibrium that are best left alone, and that the only impact that humans will have is bad. And that is a total false narrative. We are stewards, and we know enough about these ecosystems where we can help them overcome the challenges that they're facing right now, which are increasing temperatures and drought, increased human pressure, insects, exotic diseases and insects that are coming in. I mean, think of the emerald ash borer and the impact it's had in the Midwestern United States. So we somehow need to reemphasize what is reality to our public, in our educational system, and stop teaching fantasies about how things exist out there.
Peter, you're spot on with that it is so obvious today that our education system and really the conservation groups in general are using is that humans are bad for the environment. And it's always a negative if humans are involved in anything to do with the natural environment. And therefore, we need to lock it up. And in reality, humans are essential for the natural environment because there are a lot of humans in the world. And we can either be stewards or we can be passive observers, and I know that stewardship is a much better program than being a passive observer.
Well, Dan, it's important to point out that humans are the only organism on Earth that plans ahead, that looks towards the future, tries to see what's going to happen in the future, and plans for it. Everything else, whether it's trees or animals or microorganisms, are simply reactionary. They react to things as they happen. So, we do have the ability to plan for the future and moderate some of these things that are going to happen.
Perfect. I'm glad you made that statement. That is absolutely correct. Jim, one of the things that we need to do is bring back a strong forest products industry in this country. We've spent the last 20 years trying to eliminate them and bankrupt them. And Peter is absolutely right. They are not going to invest the money that's necessary to build the plant necessary to be competitive in the world unless they have a plan in place that they know they're going to have 20 years or better of productive resource utilization. So how do we bring that about?
Well, I think what we don't need, I'll start with what we don't need, and that is we don't need another government program. We don't need government protection programs. We don't need to safeguard our industries. I think what we need to do is start backing away from the regulations and all the management that inhibit entrepreneurialism, that inhibit construction of sawmills, and that that encumber those materials from flowing into the marketplace. And so we need to return back to some level of free market principles, and we need to recognize that there's varying competing markets, and there's things that need to be attended to. But whenever you have a government program, typically they function as a constraint and as a burden. And so at some level we need to look at our what we're doing, Dan, in terms of our sawmills, in terms of our managing of forest litter. For example, the federal agencies now, we have there's research being done at the federal level that could benefit the private sector in terms of biological handling biomass for octane enhancers. There's a significant deficit of octane enhancers for premium gasoline fuels. So we need to remove some of those burdens and let some of that forest litter benefit us, and then we have the free market system, which includes a profit motive, right? That's the Lockean concept of private property. We need to encourage industries to make a profit and to use the public lands, right? Multiple use and sustained yield, in that those materials flow into the economy, and encourage the profit motive. Profit motives are not bad, and I really appreciated with what Peter said there about human environment. And I'm going to add a little to that, is that human beings are the only organism. I don't like that word. We're human. We're set apart, and we have the ability to reason. And that ability to reason is what constitutes our ability to make tools and to forecast and to solve all of these problems. So we do have, Dan, at our disposal, we do have the information, and we do understand what's right. And so what we need to do is do a cut across some of the philosophies and make conscious decisions for the future and for the private sector, and to encourage entrepreneurialism, sawmills and pellets and all of the other kinds of things that come from our public lands.
Well, and when we get back to the bottom line on this, Peter's right, and you are right both, that we need to refocus on the things that made this country great, which is a respect for privacy and understanding that government is here to serve the people and not the other way around, and that there has to be a economic incentive, and it doesn't have to be a government program. It has to be an approach to kind of a hands-off that allows private investment on programs like this that will allow for a profit motive on a long-term basis that allows good stewardship. And that's exactly what this whole radio show is here to produce, and that is an understanding that that's necessary. Peter, you've been so eloquent in talking about how important it is for stewardship to understand those motives. How do you see the education system, the university system, and the forest products industry and conservation groups? Do you see a pathway to allow these groups to work together to further that idea?
Absolutely, and we've been seeing it here in Montana. I mean, we actually have some wonderful collaborative groups of conservation groups and industry and state agencies and university academia that are trying to find solutions and figure out what is the best way to go about managing and using these resources. And of course, I always refer to Montana as a place where everybody wants to live, but very few people can find a job. It is a beautiful place, but it's hard to find a job here because of limited space and resources, and we're a long ways from anywhere. And also mention that I work with a lot of private forest landowners, and there's really two philosophies that prevail amongst the entities that service private forest landowners. You can either take the philosophy that these are a bunch of people that don't know anything, and we need to guide them to do the right things, or you can adhere to the philosophy that each of these individuals is an intelligent, creative person that is going to find different solutions to their specific scenario. Now, after doing this for 25 years, I strongly adhere to that second philosophy. The intelligence and the integrity and the creativity of the landowners that I've worked with is phenomenal. And so I just try to provide them with information and let them use that information to come up with solutions that work best for them. And it works wonderfully. And that's why even though the private forest land base in Montana is total industry and otherwise is about 17% of the forested land, they produce 60% of the wood product that comes off of that land. And I'll also put it in again, just as a comparison, Montana and Germany, and you've been on a tour with me to Germany looking at Bavarian forest resources. Montana and Germany have the same land area and the same forested area, about 25 million acres. Germany has about 90 million people living on it, plus all of the other folks. Montana has 1 million people. Last year, Montana produced about 370 million board feet of wood off of our forest lands. Germany, with its high population density and its, recreation in forests, that's the number one use there, Germany produced 12.5 billion board feet of wood. So what they have produced is just so phenomenally more, and yet their forests are considered one of the most beautiful forests in the world. And granted, they don't have wilderness areas, and they're actually trying to create wilderness areas. So that would be a deficit there. I mean, wilderness areas in the appropriate places are good things to have. But it's really, really important for society to advance, to capitalize on all that individual creativity and hard work and innovation that exists out there.
And Peter, I remember when we were on that forestry tour in Germany, one of the things that stood out to me is that the state forests, which are the largest part really of the government forest, it's not federal, but it's the state of the individual provinces or states in Germany that are the big landowner, are also very much in tune with the stewardship of those forests over to private individuals, and they're actually encouraging private land ownership of the forests, and they do things to try to help promote that.
Yeah, and otherwise, most socialist nation of Germany, if people aren't aware of that, the bulk of Germany's parliament is very socialistically inclined. Forestry has remained one of those realms where, although you're restricted from changing land use, I mean, you can't remove your forest and turn it into a shopping mall without 20 years of litigation in Germany. But for the forest landowner, how they manage their forest is amazingly free of regulation. It's one of the few little bright spots in an otherwise pretty oppressive government, overregulated government, and I could tell you lots of stories about that. But nonetheless, private individuals are given a pretty free hand, and it's to their benefit because people don't sell land in Germany. Boy, if you have land, you hang on to it, and they pass it on to future generations, and so they're very income-oriented. And so passing on a functional forest to future generations is part of the social fabric of rural landowners in Germany. And so education starts in schools there, and forestry and forest management is considered a highly idealistic and sought-after thing to do there. They're not bad. It's not considered a bad thing to cut a tree because everybody understands that wood is a very important resource. And when you go into German classrooms or anywhere in Germany, everything is made out of wood. You don't see plastic like you see here in the United States everywhere. The tables are wood, the chairs are wood, the framing is wood, and so they're very focused on using organically produced materials over there, and wood is a major resource there.
Well, and they also, it is a major export into Germany. They actually are a net exporter of wood products, considerably so. And here, a state like Montana, who has all this natural resource that's underutilized, ends up buying, well, we end up buying studs from Canada and bringing stuff in from other countries, wood products, and there really isn't any excuse for that. And with that comment, I will say that in 1960, Montana, when it utilized all its natural resources, when it was being, the mining industry was strong, the timber industry was strong, we were a natural resource state. We were number 6 in the United States in per capita income. And now we are number 49 in per capita income. And there really isn't any excuse for that kind of a economic, let's say, slide over that period of time. So we need to get back into creating jobs for our children. I mean, not everyone wants to be a PhD. There's a lot of people that made a darn good living in the timber and natural resource industries.
Yeah, and just to add one other thing, I was a Fulbright scholar to Germany back in 2008 to the Bavarian Forestry Institute. And you brought up academia before, Dan, and I wanted to make a mention about that as well. one of the things I experienced when I was there at the Bavarian Forestry Institute that I thought was just brilliant and something we really need to bring to our academic institutes here in the United States is once a year at the Bavarian Forestry Institute, they brought in all of the practitioners, the dirt foresters, the landowners, etc., for a conference, and the academic faculty gave presentations about the research that they're doing. And it was wonderful because the practitioners were not always kind. I mean, they brought a sense of reality to academia, and they asked them point-blank questions of, why are you studying this? Why is this relevant to me? Why is this important? And, you know, I just sat in the back row and was amazed and chuckled half the time, because one of the problems I see in the academic world is academia has changed from a purely educational and research entity to a money-making and a prestige entity. I mean, every university wants to, it's all about making money, bringing in grants and number of publications, and showing that you have advanced to producing X number of PhDs a year. And there's a certain disconnect that is occurring between the universities and the practitioners that are out there. And I think it would be very healthy for the practitioners to have opportunities to hear what academia is producing and critique it. And it would be incredibly important for academia to be in touch with its base, the landowners, the general population out there, and have to relate to them, here's what I'm doing and here's why it's important. And when you lose that, and it seems to me we've lost some of that in academia, then academia can feed the age of fantasy rather than meeting the relevant needs of the greater population.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct on that, Peter, and that disturbs me as well, because academia has become more of a political, philosophical football, let's say, than what it was always intended to be, and that is a place of higher education that would teach people how to be productive members of society.
Well, and it should be a place where there is freedom to question everything. And nowadays, I mean, as an academician, if I went to an academic conference and questioned the validity of human-caused climate change, you know, I would be thrown out, basically. I mean, that's so universities have become very politically polarizing places, and that's very unfortunate, because they should be places where all of these questions are dealt with in a philosophical and an academic level, and personality and your own personal ego doesn't necessarily play a role.
Right. Well, I always think of the term classical liberalism is what our education system was supposed to be based on, and that is the idea that all ideas may have validity, and you are open to discussion and open ideas. And we've turned into a politically correct culture that if you don't adhere to what the let's say the flavor of the day is, you are considered an outsider, and your opinion is really marginalized. And that's something that has only happened over about the last 40 years in this country. Before then, I think we had really the most positive and the most open education system in the world. Gentlemen, we'll pick this up on the other side of the break. Jim, I'd like to get you back into the discussion.
This is The Micro Effect. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today my guests on the radio program are Jim Carlson and Dr. Peter Kolb. And Dr. Kolb just finished really explaining what he sees as a problem in academia to the process of free thinking, and I couldn't agree more. Jim, I want to get you back into the discussion because I think now you can see why I thought that it was really important that we have Dr. Kolb on this call, because you, I think, will have a new resource available to talk about these various programs that need to be looked at, and you've got someone now that hopefully through this introduction you can work with to improve the understanding of good forest management. So let's let you take it from here. Talk about your perspective of how we need to bring these programs around to a more open dialogue and how that can happen from your perspective.
I think that Dr. Kolb's view of fantasy spot on, and we're even seeing that concept of fantasy in the policy environment, the legislative environment, and it's filtering out, particularly as these generations, as the younger generations are growing older, and I'm not necessarily picking on the younger generations themselves, but Dan, I think there's a three things that we need to consider. First is that we need to recognize the value of American exceptionalism, and that is we talked about individualism and you know the intellect, allowing private landowners the latitude and Dr. Kolb used the example in the private forest management in Montana, and I think that's just spot on. Is that we need to take those models forward. Is when people are unencumbered and they are allowed the latitude and responsibility for their own lives and their own private lands and resources, they become creative. They when they have information at their fingertips to benefit their lands and to because people ultimately want to be good stewards of the environment, and so. And for example, the ranchers, in my view, I work with a lot of ranchers. I work with a lot of farmers. I live in farming country. Ranchers and farmers are, in my view, hands down the best conservationists there are in the world, because they're immediate stewards of the land. They walk the land every day, and the fruits of the land are the productive pursuits of the ranchers and farmers are what yield their livelihood. And so it stands to reason they would be conservationists, the best conservationists. So with respect to policy, I think what we need to do, and let's go back to earlier in the program when we talked about the policy reforms, and we spoke briefly about the National Forest Management Act of 1976. And I think we need to focus on take our policies, and we need to do some specific things. And one of the problems we're having, for example, when U.S. Forest Service goes to revise a resource management plan, one of the things that happens is they go through this layer of bureaucracy to get things done. And I think we need to streamline Section 6 of the National Forest Management Act of 1976. Now, what do I mean by that? We need to start drawing boxes around things, and that would be, for example, is you have tremendous influx whenever U.S. Forest Service goes to revise an RMP. There's this influx, Dan, of opinions from all over the nation and in fact all over the world. And so I think we need to start establishing a statutory and legal hierarchy of who really could participate in a resource management plan. And then that could be local land users, that could be county governments, for example. And I think we need to also, and Dan, you know me, I never miss an opportunity to get in a plug for the power and the authority of local governments. Local governments are where it is. If you're a county commissioner on the receiving end of my voice, you have tremendous 9th and 10th Amendment of U.S. constitutional powers, and those need to be used to engage the state and the federal government, and in a way that is positive for the citizens and the taxpayers that of your county. Now, so local participation, a hierarchy, draw boxes around local participation. I think we need to talk, have a conversation too, Dan, and maybe you want to consider a separate program here of non-governmental organizations, NGOs. And the Soros Foundation and Gates Foundation and Hewlett Packard and all those folks, there's all of these NGOs, and when it comes down to it, the large and it's really kind of a shell game. Is many of the conservation groups pour money into dozens and dozens and dozens of these 501c3s, and then they do certain things under a certain brand name, and so those are all non-governmental organizations, and they've attempted in the past, Dan, to come to the table during the resource management planning process and pose as a government, and they don't have government status. They're the public, and so I think we need to go and relegate NGOs to the public status. So that's another practical thing we could do. Maps, and I've got two more down here to talk about. These are practical things, changes we could make to the National Forest Management Act of 1976 or other statutes, and this has to do with maps. One of the things we've observed is at the federal level, there's a tremendous amount of mischief when it comes to maps. And so one of the policy changes that we think you could make would be to require that before any policy could be forwarded, you have to have a professional land surveyed map that has been approved and that is part of the Federal Register and that everybody agrees on before you can enact any policies whatsoever. That would, for example, the CORE Act that's been sponsored by Senator Bennett, if it had a map, that would significantly slow the process down, and it would allow your inholders to have a look at the effects that legislation would have. So I think we need to really focus on the importance of maps, and they need to be published in the Federal Register. So those are some practical things from a policy perspective that would help us address some of the fantasies and bring us back to the actual science of land management.
Well, Jim, one of the things that was always part of our decision-making process in the United States was that we're based on the concept of sovereignty, the rights of the individual. The rights of the individual flow from God. We give some of those rights to local government, and local government is the next to the highest. The individual is a sovereign. The next to the highest is local government. Further, the road is state government, and federal government was always designed to be the least powerful of the government agencies. Now, I understand things change. That has changed a lot, but the reason for that was to keep decisions over local conditions and local issues, keep those decisions at the local level so that the people that actually had to live on the land and live with the decisions had input. And that's exactly, we've gone the exact opposite. We've gone into this so-called democracy thing where literally people in other countries around the world are part of the decision-making process on wilderness and so many of these other things, and that is not right.
Right. And Dan, what you're speaking of is this goes back to history. You have top-down versus bottom-up management, and in our system of government, It's based on natural law. It's based on the philosophy that there's a God of the universe. There's a universal set of laws that apply to all of man throughout all of history and throughout all of cultures. And then under that you have the state. So the state is not independent of the laws of God. Now, in Marxism, for example, the state is the final authority. So if you go to Russia, Soviet Russia, the state was the final authority. They do not recognize natural law or natural law theory. That is, Dan, ultimately the struggle that we're having is federalism is pushing the power further and further up away from the people, and our concept of American constitutional government actually brings power back to the people. That is why the 3,028 counties, plus or minus, in the United States, that's why our founding fathers in their wisdom did just that. They concentrated the taxing authority at the local level for private property and for property taxes. The state can't tax properties, and neither can the federal government. I assure you, if they could, they would. And so that taxing prerogative is concentrated at the local level. And so what we're witnessing in socialism is an attempt to reverse this situation and move power up toward Washington, D.C. And that's really ultimately what we have here, even in public lands. We have a power struggle.
We do have a power struggle, and that's why Peter's conversations about stewardship and individuals being, the best land stewards is so right on. And that's also why we need to try to make local control of decision-making much stronger and reduce the influence of all these political groups and certainly foreign political groups in our decision-making on forest policy. Peter, I want you back into this conversation. Tell us what you think about what we've just talked about.
Well, I agree 100% with what Jim was saying and the thread of this discussion. And, I can relate. My ancestors came from Germany, and my parents immigrated from Germany after World War II. And my mom's side of the family, which were farmers, and we can trace their farms and ancestry back to the 1600s, so 400 years of successful farmers. Unfortunately, we're in the Russian-occupied zone of Germany after World War II, which came under communist rule. And this was some of the most productive farmland in all of Germany. Well, in the 50 or so years of communist rule, East Germany could not feed itself, and all the family farms were dissolved, and it was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster. Whereas West Germany, that maintained the family farms, outproduced East Germany 10-1. And the same went for Poland and Ukraine, that used to be the breadbasket of Europe. They had to import wheat from the United States to feed themselves. And so we have seen the same thing with national forests, and this is an unfortunate consequence. I happen to be a fan of the concept of national forests because it set aside some land that doesn't exist elsewhere in the United States. Now, like I said, I grew up in Wisconsin. And when I wanted to go someplace and go hiking, I had to get a lot of permission and hop a lot of barbed wire fences. And so Idaho and Montana, to me, were just heaven on earth because it had all this public land to go and hunt and hike and recreate on, and the wild areas and all of that. So I'm a big fan of that. However, the Forest Service has become a facsimile of the former Soviet Union, where it is a top-down organization that cannot respond to the local nuances, local ecology, local needs, local history, all of those types of things. And so there does need to be some local influence on how national forests are managed, because even though they do belong to everybody in the United States, which is a great thing, I mean, it's a wonderful model, it hasn't worked the way it has been going the last 30 years or so. And so those that most understand the local ecology and the local situation need to have some say in how those local forests are being managed and what resources they provide. And so, you know, this is still an experiment. We're still learning as we go along with all of this. And so we always have to be asking ourselves, how can I do this better? And individuals are an important part of all of that.
They are, and one of your comments about local control, it's really important that our local citizens get more active and more involved. You cannot be, you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And one thing about our system of government, it was designed to be really monitored, and participation was absolutely essential. And I think over the last 50 years, we've been educating and training people to expect the government to make decisions for you rather than making your own. And a lot of the independence that we had as a nation has been lost because now we are treating decision making as something that has to come from someone else, and there's a lack of accountability. And accountability is a huge part of self-governance.
Well, I agree. It's a large part of education, too. So, yeah, we've been very strongly motivated to do away with individual responsibility because individuals make mistakes, and we want to try and avoid those. And you see that in wildland firefighting agencies and et cetera. You know, everything is predicted through models and projected, and agencies really want to take away individual decision-making powers because they're afraid that an individual will make a bad mistake. And that goes with forest management, too. On federal lands, very rarely do you see an individual who spends their entire life and career managing the same land. And that's a real shame because as you do things, particularly in land management, where there are so many variables at play, it's the mistakes you make teach you a lot. And being able to experience those and learn from those mistakes is what makes you an expert. And that's why private farmers are much better at farming their land than a collective farm like under the former Soviet Union. And so it is with forest management as well. And so I don't think, I don't want individualism to be in place so that we can go after the individual that made the mistake. I want it in place so that individuals can learn from their mistakes and continually improve what they do. And that's really necessary in land management.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Peter. And that is also something that's changed a lot in the last 20 years, is that we try, in our modern society, we try to find scapegoats or find, reasons or people that are responsible for bad decisions and penalize them. And it used to be that, we could learn from our mistakes. Now they've made it so, they've had so many penalties for people making mistakes that they turn that responsibility over to a government agency, and that's wrong. That just doesn't make any sense. Peter, I want you to talk about the stewardship program in Montana. I'll give you an opportunity to do a little plugging for that, and the forestry programs at U of M and Montana State University, and then we'll give Jim an opportunity to talk about his organization as well.
Well, sure. The stewardship program, I work for the Extension Service, which is through the land grant university, and our role is to take university research and bring it to the practitioner. And it's real important to emphasize there that my job is to provide landowners with information, not direction. And that's an important distinction, because I, on a daily basis, glean through a lot of research, some of which is very applicable and a whole lot of which is not. But nonetheless, it's part of my job is to go through all that. And then we provide workshops for private landowners. The stewardship program is one of those, which is, by the way, funded by the U.S. Forest Service. The Forest Service does have a mandate to help private forest landowners. And so they've chosen to provide funding to various programs. Either it's in many states, it's run through the state land management agency, like the DNRC, or Department of Natural Resources and Conservation here in Montana. And they've basically, we applied many years ago at the inception of this for a grant to run an educational program. So the stewardship program is we help private forest landowners. We provide them with an aerial map of their property, and we do a 3-day program, 2 days in the classroom, where we teach them about the ecology and the species and the insects and the diseases and how to inventory the resources. Then we send them home for a week with equipment, and they do an inventory of their land, and they come back a week later for the 3rd day to put together a forest management plan. And we are just there as coaches. We answer the questions. We tell them about how these basic processes work, because, I mean, this is you're looking at 6 years of university education to learn all these things. So we're not trying to turn a landowner into a master's student of forestry. But we're providing them with information, answering the questions, and they develop their own forest management plan based on the conditions that are out there. And then we continually offer continuing education classes in fire and fuel hazard reduction and insect diseases, soils, etc. It's a highly successful program. We've had over 3,000 landowners. Dan, you're one of them, who've gone through this program. And we have over 1.3 million acres of Montana private forest lands have gone through this program, and as a result, these landowners are aware of what they're doing. And really my goal is that when these landowners walk through the forest, they are reading it like you would read a book. And you can't read a book unless you learn how to read first. So we teach them how to read. We don't tell them what their story is. And it's really, really important because, like I said, we want to capture the creativity that's out there, not suppress it by telling them what they should do. And so that is administered through Montana State University, the Extension Program, which is where the College of Ag is. I'm housed at the University of Montana, where the College of Forestry and Conservation exists. And their main role here is research and teaching, producing our future foresters. And I participate with classes and students here as well. And again, one of my main objectives is when I'm teaching students, and I guest lecture a fair amount, is to keep it real, so that they realize what's going on out there and what they need to be doing as foresters out there. So that's pretty much my role and how this works in Montana.
Well, I'll tell you, it's an important role, Peter, and you've been a friend for many, many years, and I can say that you're one of the most gifted college professors that I've run into in my life, and I've run into a lot of them. So thank you for your part in that. Jim, I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your group, Stillwater Technical Solutions, and some of the things that you are trying to accomplish as well.